Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Veg Grower Podcast. My name's Richard and I want to encourage and inspire you to grow more of your own food. And I do this by sharing exactly what I've been up to in my own allotment and my own kitchen garden. Now we're starting this week off in the kitchen garden, the vegetable garden here at home. And it is the middle of March, which means spring is literally just around the corner. In fact, when this podcast is released, we will be entering spring, the first week of spring. Now this means that obviously all our seed sowing and everything else is going to start ramping up. And I mentioned this in previous episode. But the other thing is the weather does get warmer. And one of the things that I've realised is that we can help make our lives a little bit easier and accelerate this by the use of cold frames. Now, I'm a big fan of a cold frame because I find that if you haven't got a greenhouse, you haven't got the space for a greenhouse or something like that, a cold frame is a good alternative. It's a much smaller version of a greenhouse, which just helps warm up the soil or keep your plants warm for a little bit longer. And obviously I am very lucky. I do have a greenhouse which is 6 foot by 6 foot. And earlier this year I also bought a grow house, which is just a raised version of a cold frame. But we do need more. We do need more because we have got lots and lots of plants. And for me, cold frames are the perfect thing. So this week I've been getting all my cold frames ready. Now I've got a wide variety of different cold frames, one being my grow house, another being a cold frame that is much lower to the ground. This one in particular is only sort of 30 centimetres to 45 centimetres tall, with a wooden frame making it into a rectangle about 1 metre long by 50 centimetres wide, and it has basically in between the wooden frame clear plastic twin-wall polycarbonate, which makes a mini greenhouse. And this is fantastic because it just means that I can use that to move some of my plants on when they need a bit more space. Tomatoes, chilies, etc, etc. I think we can start getting those out into cold frames or into the greenhouse. In fact, last week I actually bought a couple of these plants out into my cold frame. This was an aubergine, a chili and a pepper, and they have survived this last week. We did actually get a drop in temperature overnight over the last week as well, so they have survived out in the grow house, so I think they will be fine in the cold frame as well. This just frees up more space indoors because, trust me, everywhere that I can grow plants, I have got plants growing, and it's very keen to try and expand on the space that we have, so more and more room is a must. The thing is, a cold frame does take up space, and ideally what we would like is to use them on our beds as well. And this is where my hoop tunnels that also double as a cold frame have came into use. I've got 4 of these aluminium frames which I inherited from my grandfather, and what they are is basically a metal frame that serves as making a mini polytunnel. They're about 1.5 metres long, and we pop corrugated plastic on the inside to form a hoop tunnel. Nice and easy, and I've actually placed a couple of these over some of the soil in order to just warm up the soil, ready that next week I can plant something like peas straight into the ground, which should hopefully make things a little bit faster for me and bring things along a little bit more. Added to that, because I only have 4 of these and I've got quite a bit of land here and on the allotment, I've also made a temporary cold frame. Now this is just a simple wooden rectangular box that I've used with the bottom missing that I've placed on the soil, and then on top of that I've put a glass door. Now we don't have to use a glass door, this is just what I had lying around just to make my life easy, and we could use something like plastic or anything like that, perspex, just something clear so that we can just pop in some plants and harden them off and get them growing for the following season. Now for me, one of the things that I do like to do with cold frames is use them as part of my production line when it comes to seed sowing. As you know, and I've mentioned this time and time before, I start them off indoors in heated propagators and just gradually move them along as they harden off. The trouble, however, is when it is still cold like we have at the moment, we can't pop them straight outside. So what I like to do is use the cold frames. And one of the advantages of using a cold frame is that if your plants are in there, there's no moving them in and out every day. What many gardeners will do to harden off their plants, which is a while off yet, don't get me wrong, but they will actually move their plants in to the greenhouse at night and out again in the morning. To me, that seems like a lot of work. Instead, what I like to do is move them into my grow frame where all the lids and doors are closed, apart from when I need to water or get in there. Once they have been in there for a week, I then move them to another cold frame, and that cold frame I just open the lid during the day, close it again at night, and that works much better for me because I'm not moving the plants around. Instead, I'm just opening and closing a lid, and that just speeds things up. It makes it more of a job that we can handle quickly as opposed to one that takes time. Now, cold frames do require a bit of investment, but we can also make our own, and I've been quite happy making our own late this week as well, as I said, with the wooden box and a piece of glass. We may have to add more in the future as well, just to bring things along. Cold frames, fantastic piece of kit. They're going to come into their own at the moment, and if you haven't got any, you might want to pop down to a shop and see about getting some, or make your own. So that's what I've been concentrating on here at the Veg Grower Podcast Kitchen Garden. I'm going to head on down to the allotment because it is potato planting time. In the meantime, let's find out what's been going on in the Supporters Club this week. Well, I'm just going to interrupt this podcast and just ask, if you are enjoying this podcast, please take a few seconds to leave us a rate and review. Only takes you a few seconds, but it means the world to us and helps us get found by other people who might also be interested in growing their own food. Now, added to that, this podcast is also able to continue running with thanks to members of our Supporters Club. Our Supporters Club is a club that we run to help encourage more people to grow their own food, but more importantly, keep this podcast running. We charge just £5 a month to be a member, which I think is an absolute bargain, especially as what you get is well worth that £5. You get access to extra behind the scenes podcasts that give you a bit of an idea of what's going on here at the Veg Grower Podcast HQ. Added to that, you also once a month get through your letterbox our monthly seed pack, which contains a mini newspaper which gives you a few ideas of what you can do that month, as well as a bit of guidance on how to sow the seeds, because included in that seed pack you get a collection of seeds that can be sown in that very month. And we try and sow those right throughout the month under a bit of guidance, which also follows on with the extra podcasts that I put out. Now, for an example, over this last week, we have sown some lettuce and some spring onions, which are giving us a bit of a head start when it comes to salad crops, but I think they are well worthwhile. We do like our salad crops here at the Veg Grower Podcast HQ. We eat a lot of them, and they are great for keeping us healthy, especially when they are homegrown. Now, if that is something you would be interested in, then head to the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk to find out more and hopefully sign up. Right, back to the gardening. Well, I'm down on the allotment now, and today I have been focusing on just one important task. Now, I said last week about visiting the allotment every day, which is something I've started being able to do. And because of that, I'm able to concentrate on the little annoying jobs such as weeding and watering during the week. And that frees up just a few hours on the weekend in which I can concentrate on a big job. And today's big job was to plant my potatoes. Yes, potato planting time is upon us. Now, I say potato planting time because for me, I always plant my potatoes around St. Patrick's Day, which is the 17th of March. Traditionally, or many gardeners would plant their potatoes on Easter weekend. But I pretty much decided not to do that after doing a fair bit of research. The main reason being that Easter weekend moves around. So, for example, this year it is in the middle of April, but often it can be around the middle of March. So it can be up to 6 weeks difference of when Easter is. And that means if we plant our potatoes towards the end of April, we've lost 6 weeks of growth. So for me, March the 17th, around mid-March, just as spring is kicking in, is the ideal time to plant out our potatoes. Now, over the last few months, I've spent quite a bit of time preparing our beds ready for potatoes. I've got 3 beds. These are my large corrugated iron beds that I have here on the allotment. And these beds are for potatoes this year because I rotate my crops around. And these 3 beds, what I've done to prepare them, towards the end of last year, I sowed a green manure that is specifically designed for pre-potatoes or pre-spuds. This green manure contains plants that aid potato growth, either by fumigating the soil from some of the pests and diseases that potatoes are susceptible to, but also by adding nutrients that potatoes really need. This actually did do quite well. It did get hit by the frost, so I had to cut it all down about 6 weeks ago in the middle of January. I left all that foliage just on the soil for all the worms to drag into the soil, and then I covered over the beds with some weed suppressing membrane. Now, the weed suppressing membrane was one, to warm up the soil so that when we did plant our potatoes, they got off to a bit of a stronger start. But 2, it was to suppress any weeds. Now, I was hoping when I peeled back this weed suppressing membrane today, there was going to be no weeds growing at all. Well, unfortunately, that didn't quite work. I peeled back all the weed suppressor membrane and there was still some couch grass and other weeds that had sprouted up. Now, I say sprouted up. The growth on these weeds was very, very poor. They looked very yellow, as if they weren't getting any sunlight. They were clearly not going to survive any longer. So by peeling it back, may have actually got these weeds to survive. We will see. But I hoed them and I dug out any weeds that I could dig out, and hopefully that will be okay. Then it came down to actually planting our potatoes. Now, what I do, because I like to grow or have a bit of organisation with my potatoes, 3 beds, 3 different types of potatoes. So 1 bed is my first early potatoes, the second early go in my second bed, and the main crops go in my 3rd bed. So I planted all my potatoes out, and I started off with my main crops. Now, main crops do take a little bit longer. Generally speaking, most people who plant their potatoes will probably start with the first earlies 1 week, the second earlies the following week, and the main crops a little bit later. I like to do all mine in one go. But because main crops need a little bit more space, I like to start by planting out the main crops first, just so I can make sure that we have enough room for those. The reason being, for me, main crops are probably the most important potatoes that we grow because they are our main potatoes. We want more main crops than we have of anything else. And they go into storage and should hopefully last right throughout the winter quite well. So I started with our main crops. I gave them about 30 centimetres of space around each potato, and I dug them down 20 to 30 centimetres deep in order to get them planted. Now, I just used a trowel to plant these out. In the past, what I have actually used is a bulb planter, and that actually works quite well, but I can't find my bulb planter at the moment. So I just used a trowel, dug a hole, and popped a single seed potato in. Now, my seed potatoes have been chitting in my greenhouse since January. So what we wanted to see was some of the potatoes just start to sprout, and they had actually just started to sprout. Very young growth on them, and I just made sure that those chits were pointing upwards. Popped them in the hole, chits pointing up, covered them back over, and then moved on to the next one. And I repeated until all my potatoes were planted out. And thankfully, we had enough to plant up all 3 beds. Now, what we could have done, if we wanted to make more potato plants out of one seed potato, what we could have done was actually cut the potatoes into 3 pieces, making sure each piece of potato has an eye. We should have done that yesterday, then just allowed the cut to dry out a bit before planting. Now, we could still do that with some other potatoes should we feel the need, but this is just a way of trying to make sure that your money goes a little bit further, i.e. you only buy 5-6 seed potatoes from a garden centre, you cut them into 3 and you end up with 18 potato plants. That's a general idea. I don't bother with that. Too much work for me. I just want to get them planted and get them done. Now that they are planted, we gave them a very, very good watering, and we will probably cover these over with a fleece just to try and keep them warm. It has dropped in temperature over the last few days, and we are seeing freezing temperatures, so we just want to make sure that those potato plants, when they start to grow, are not affected by the frost, because that can actually happen. Eventually we will start to see these potatoes grow, and then what we then want to do as they grow is mulch the potatoes in order to, one, promote more potatoes. The way potatoes grow, they sort of produce more potatoes, but also it excludes light from getting to the potatoes and means we won't have green skinned potatoes. Now, I tend to do this because I grow in beds. All I do is I add a bucket of compost over all the potatoes and just build the soil up. Again, traditionally what people would do is draw soil from around the potato and build the soils up with that. But I just use compost and build it up that way. We could, of course, not necessarily use compost. We could use any type of mulch. Grass cuttings have worked very well for me in the past, as does straw or anything like that. But compost, as always, is best. Potatoes are an incredibly hungry plant, so we need to make sure that if we're using compost, there's plenty of nutrients in it. We could, of course, add a potato fertiliser, feed, bloodfish and bone or grow more would help as well. And that should hopefully go on to promote and grow a lot of good potatoes. Now, when it comes to harvesting, the first earlies are generally the first ones that I harvest. And these can be harvested as early as late May, June. And that's another reason that I like to start off with first earlies. We'll start harvesting first earlies as soon as they are ready, and we slowly make our way down through the beds. We don't harvest all potatoes in one go, of course, in the first earlies and the second earlies. We harvest those as we need them. We just slowly harvest a few, take them home, enjoy them for a few meals, come and get more, and continue doing that right throughout the season. Main crops, however, we leave those in the ground until all the foliage dies down, and then we give it a couple of weeks, and then we dig them up, leave them on the surface of the soil to harden, and then we harvest those and put those into storage. The first earlies I tend to start harvesting once the flowers start showing. The second earlies once the flowers have died off. That's a good way of working out when to harvest, but that is all in the future. For now, the potatoes are growing. We've just now got to look after them and hope that they grow. I will keep you posted and let you know how we get on. Right, let's head back to the potting shed.
Chopping all the veggies, sizzle in the air. Chef's got with the magic, smells are everywhere. Water starts to boil, onions hit the pan. Recipe of the week, let the feast begin. Cooking with Chef Scott, flavors come alive. Tune in every week for a tasty bite.
Hi, it's Scott here with this week's recipe. And this week we have a spring vegetable risotto, something I look forward to making every year with the first pickings of spring vegetables. So, let's head to the kitchen and hear how it's made. As usual, you can find this recipe and others on the Veg Grower Podcast.co.uk and on my Instagram page, Seed to Table Plot 13. This recipe serves two, and you will need 120 grams of fresh peas, 120 grams of courgettes diced, 120 grams of asparagus chopped into small rounds, 200 grams of baby leaf spinach, 10 leaves of basil, 4 tablespoons of chopped fresh parsley, 2 tablespoons of olive oil, 20 grams of butter, 100 grams of shallots diced, 1 clove of garlic diced, 150 grams of arborio risotto rice, 75 millilitres of white wine, 320 millilitres of vegetable stock, and 30 grams of grated parmesan. Method: start by bringing the vegetable stock to a boil, then add the baby leaf spinach and blitz with a stick blender. Now, in a saucepan, start sweating off the shallots and garlic until soft, and then add the rice. Give it a good stir, and then add the white wine, and allow to reduce for 1 minute. Now, start adding the stock a little at a time, allowing the rice to absorb the stock before adding more. When the stock is half used, add the vegetables and herbs to the pan. Then continue to add the rest of the stock until it's used up. Then finish the risotto with the parmesan and the butter, and that's the recipe done. And that's it from me this week.
Well, that was another fantastic recipe right there from Chef Scott. Sometimes he makes me very, very hungry. I don't know about you, but it certainly makes me very, very hungry. But that's a good thing, because that's why we wanted a chef on to share some really good recipes. Now, over this last week, I've actually had a few emails come in, and I wanted to share with you some of these emails that I've got in, because some of the questions are actually really, really good. First of all, I've had an email from Robert, and Robert's email says, Richard, you have mentioned AI for seed sowing on a few of your podcasts lately. What do you do to find it? Can you put a link up or direct me in the right direction, please? Robert. What I did for creating my seed sowing plan for the entire year using AI is I went to a service called ChatGPT. You've probably heard of it if you've had any idea of what is going on with AI. And I just asked ChatGPT this very simple question that I want to create a weekly seed sowing plan for the entire year of 2025. I want a collection of seeds that I can be sowing every week that are for my edible gardening. I want them to be vegetable, fruit, herbs, as well as companion planting and green manures. And my location is in Littlehampton, West Sussex, the United Kingdom. I tried to be as specific as I could be and trying to dial it down to my location. And then it spat out an entire plan for the entire year. It gives me about 6 seeds to sow every single week. It wasn't easy. It did take a bit of fine tuning, but we got there in the end. Now, if you want to see a copy of my seed sowing plan, I will try and attach it onto the blog post for this episode. It might be quite a big file, so keep an eye on it and just see how it goes. But it has been quite a useful tool. I don't agree with everything that it says, such as sowing pumpkins in February and things like that. But we are following it, and it is working quite well, I have to say. We are actually seeing that a lot of our young plants are growing fairly well, quite young, but they are growing fairly well, and they seem to be doing pretty well. We have lots of tomatoes. We've got lots of all the other plants that we may need, and it does seem to be adding a bit of structure. I'm still keeping a close eye on it because I still feel there's more seeds that we could be sowing, and there's more other ways of doing this. But as a first attempt, it seems to be doing quite well. The only thing it couldn't predict, of course, was the weather. And there's been times that it's said to sow a green manure outside directly in a garden, and the weather it wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work. It would be too cold. The seeds would be frozen. It just wouldn't work. So we have had to use a little bit of ingenuity, a little bit of common sense, or a little bit of experience at the same time to try and work out exactly what these seeds are all about. But I have to admit, it does seem to be working quite well. Now, added to that, I've also had an email from Martin. And Martin is saying that, thanks for the podcast. My wife and I are allotmenteers in Drybridge Allotments, Hereford. Since I retired, I've listened to all your podcasts from the ones you did in lockdown until now, March 2025. I've enjoyed them enormously, but as I have listened to them on a Google button in bed before I submerge for the day, I get a little confused to what time of year your podcast is recording, as you do not give a time of year. Example, first week of March, second week of August. I've listened to them sometimes out of sequence. Maybe it could be help future listeners to not get confused. Keep up the good work, Martin. Thank you very much for that email as well, Martin. I have to say, when I first started this podcast, on pretty much every recording, I used to include the exact date, be it the 15th of March 2023 or something along those lines. But a couple of years ago, I felt, because my gardening routine was changing, in the sense that I was spending every day on the allotment or every day in the vegetable garden, I just felt that leaving those sort of dates in didn't quite fit in. But I do take on what you say about it being the time of the year, because actually that was one of the key things that I used to create this podcast around, and why I included the date, because I didn't want somebody listening who was listening in August and I was talking about what's going on in March. Because although I produce these podcasts every week, not everybody listens to them at the time that they are published. So yes, I take on that on board, and I have tried in today's podcast to repeatedly say the middle of March. And that's something I will try and bear in mind as we move forward. For me, it's all about the flow of a podcast, a flow of storytelling. So I do have to err on a side of caution when it comes to dates to make sure that it works. Now, both of these communications was on our email, which is always good to get emails. If you want to send an email, it's richard@theveggrowerpodcast.co.uk. But we have also had people leave a rate and review over on Spotify. Now, if you haven't rated and reviewed this podcast on your podcast provider, please do go do it. Only takes you a few seconds, but it means the world to us. It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many, many others, Podbean and things like that. That is so useful to us because it gives us some really good feedback, and it also gets the algorithms working for us. But we've had a couple on Spotify which read like this. James says, I recently started listening to this podcast and I just wanted to say how much I'm enjoying it. It's well thought out and put together. Great job. Thanks for the fantastic content. I've also been watching the YouTube channel. Thank you very much for that, James. It's always good to hear back from new listeners. We do try our hardest to make sure that everybody is happy, of course. And I like it when I do get some appreciation. Lynn also says, really good podcast, Richard. This is on the back of last week's podcast, by the way. I heard you say about little and often before. It really does work. I'm also completely agree with spending some time to stop and enjoy your space. I do yoga and I often just stop when I'm in the plot or the garden and do a few yoga poses and completely absorb the whole atmosphere of where I am. The recipe today was mouth-watering and so simple. I just can't wait to get some of my own tomatoes to try them. Lynn. Thank you very much for that, Lynn, as well. Now, last week's podcast, we actually got a few comments over on YouTube because I do actually have a YouTube channel. We do our live stream on there every Sunday, but we also put this podcast out on there as well. Ballycillian Allotment Man, who's a regular contributor to the live show actually, he says, I totally agree with you, Richard. Little and often and a few hours on Sunday when I'm at work makes the allotment maintenance easier. It really annoys me when I have to watch what I say when every spring when the sun is shining, the fair weather gardeners return to the allotments and say, I'm lucky I got a better plot than them. Theirs is covered in weeds. You know, I'm not going to slate anybody for being fair weather gardeners. Everybody is different, and that's fair enough. But I do believe that little and often, and trying to visit the allotment right throughout the winter does make our lives so much easier. And I've been banging on about this for a few years now. Every single day, try and visit the allotment if you can. Every single day, try and do something in the garden if you can. It makes all the difference. And in these comments, we've had 2 people agree with me who have taken it on board or done it anyway, and it has helped them out. So please do. Little and often will make all the difference. Well, that is all the feedback I've got over this last week. There was quite a bit to go through, but I love it when we do get feedback like that and we can actually add some content with the podcast from it. If you want to get in touch, then please do rate and review. Please do email me, richard@veggrowerpodcast.co.uk. You can also find me on social media where you can get in touch as well. You can also visit the website at theveggrowerpodcast.co.uk. You can leave us a comment on the bottom of a blog post, or you can also leave us a voicemail, which are also good as well. And don't forget, if you have enjoyed this podcast, then please consider becoming a member of our supporters club. We will be back again next time, so until then, please take care.